right, awesome. Thank you so much. So OLPS was published back in November of 2023, and it has some staggered implementation dates for specific types of producers that we'll go over. But overall, the rule was introduced to try and reduce confusion about livestock practices, to establish specific standards for avian species, as well as clarify indoor and outdoor space requirements and strengthen the animal welfare and care portions of the regulations. So the timeline for implementation is everything except for these exceptions are folks are required to comply by the beginning of this year. But the exceptions are folks that were certified before January 2nd of this year. For layer operations, they have an extended period to comply with the outdoor stocking density requirements and soil and vegetation requirements. For broiler operations that were already certified before January 2nd, they have extended period to comply with the indoor and outdoor stocking density requirements, as well as soil and vegetation requirements. And then lastly, organic poultry operations that were certified prior to January 2nd have until January 2029 to comply with the poultry house exit area requirements. And you'll see throughout my presentation that the regulations that are highlighted in this orange tan color are the ones that have these extended deadlines for implementation. So to look at an overview of how this rule has affected the organic regulations, there are 17 new terms that were added that we'll take a look at. There were no changes to the origin of livestock or the livestock feed sections. There were additions to both the livestock care and production practices standards, as well as the mammalian and non-avian livestock living conditions sections. No changes to the pasture standard. And then the big thing that we're going to talk about is the avian living conditions section, which is new with this rule. So here are those 17 new terms that are now defined in the regulations themselves. A lot of them have to do with physical alterations, as well as indoor and outdoor space, and some of the terms related to space and stocking density. All right, so I'm going to go through each of the sections that had additions or revisions as they appear in the regulations. So I'm going to start with 205, 238, which is the care and production practices. So let's jump into it. The first thing we're going to talk about are physical alterations. So the regulations now state that they can be performed for the purpose of safety or identification. That being that they are performed at a young age in a manner that minimizes pain and stress, and by a person that's capable of performing them in that way. And along with that, there are some restricted and also prohibited physical alterations. So under the restricted category, those would be ones that cannot be performed routinely and can only be performed if alternative methods have failed. So that would be needle teeth clipping in pigs, no more than the top 1/3 of the tooth, and then tail docking in pigs. And then the explicitly prohibited physical alterations for our avian species, that would be debeaking, desnooting, caponization, dubbing, toe clipping of chickens, toe clipping of turkeys, unless it's done with infrared at a hatchery, beak trimming after 10 days of age, and induced molting. And prohibited physical alterations for non-avian species would be tail docking, waddling, face branding of cattle, and then tail docking of sheep shorter than the distal end of the caudal fold, and then museling of sheep. And then another clarification about surgical procedures that are done to treat illness or injury would be that they should be done in a way that promotes the animal's well-being and health, including any allowed medications that would be allowed under the 603 national list, including anesthetics, analgesics, and sedatives. So some more aspects under this care section and health would be, in addition, that producers should be monitoring their herd or flock for lameness. A clarification on hormones, that C3 section. Of course, hormones cannot be used for growth, promotion, production, or reproduction, but they can be used for allowed medical treatments. So an example would be oxytocin, which is allowed under 603, but is only allowed for like emergency post-calving or situations and not for other uses. And then C9 would be something that most people are already doing, but identifying and recording treatment of sick animals. And then section D, more of this planning and record requirements of minimizing internal parasite problems. So trying to prevent those and having a plan for that, as well as having a plan for euthanizing sick or injured livestock. So there are a few methods that are like explicitly prohibited now in the regulations. So those would be suffocation, manual blows to the head by blunt instruments, manual blunt force trauma, or the use of equipment that crushes the neck. And then lastly, our last slide of this section would be a clarification as part of OLPS about withdrawal periods for dairy animals. So there are certain substances on the national list that are allowed, but are restricted in the way that there needs to be a withdrawal period after they're administered. So of course, milk cannot be sold, labeled, or represented as organic during that withdrawal period, but the milk can be fed to organic calves at the same operation during the withdrawal period. So some of those common medications or substances that might be administered would be Banamine, butyrphenol, or lidocaine. Those all have withdrawal periods associated with them in the regulations. All right, let's jump into the mammalian and non-avian living conditions. So this is 205, 239. All right, so housing and outdoor space. So there was a revision in the language of the regulations to now allow for creep feeders and self feeders. The regulations now require indoor bedding or resting areas, so they should be large enough and keep livestock clean, dry, and free of lesions. There are now requirements for dairy livestock or dairy young stock housing, excuse me. So those would be, they need to be in visual sight of other animals. They need to be able to stand up, turn around, groom themselves, have enough space. And then section 11, if confined housing with stalls are used, there needs to be enough space again for natural behaviors. Cages are prohibited. And then livestock must have year-round outdoor access. We all know this in the livestock regulations, but now we have this piece about vegetative cover. So if soil is part of that outdoor space, then vegetation should be maintained as it is appropriate for the season and climate and where the animals are. Okay, and then related to housing, there are a few temporary confinement clarifications that were included as part of OLPS. So livestock may be confined for breeding or insemination, but they can't be confined longer to observe estrus or after pregnancy to confirm pregnancy. And then livestock may be confined for youth projects, and of course, organic animals have to be sold at certified um, facilities, but there is this exemption for youth projects that organic animals could be sold at like a youth fair of some sort, even if the facility is not certified organic. All right, all right, let's jump into swine. So this is 239A. So group housing is required for swine. Sows may be housed individually at farrowing or during the suckling period, but crates, gestation or farrowing crates are prohibited in the regulations. Boars may be housed individually if they pose a threat to the other animals, as well as swine may be housed individually after multiple documented instances of aggression, or to allow an individual to recover from an illness. And then the regulations now explicitly prohibit flat decks or piglet crates. And lastly, for swine, that um, we see in the regulations over and over again these terms about being able to exhibit natural behaviors. So they've now outlined for swine that housing should allow for rooting behaviors. So that might be in soil or deep packed straw or some other sort of material. All right, here's the big one. Avian living conditions 205 to 41. So this is the new section. It covers turkeys, geese, quail, pheasants, and any other bird species that are raised for organic eggs, meat, and other agricultural products. 241A covers the basic living requirements, and they're very similar to the previously established livestock living requirements, but now they explicitly call out some of those species-specific behaviors or requirements like dust bathing or adequate outdoor space to escape aggressive behavior from other chickens, that sort of thing. So along those lines, there should be enough space for birds to move freely, stretch both wings, exhibit those natural behaviors like dust bathing, scratching, perching. There is now a requirement for ammonia testing in chicken indoor space and poultry housing. And then also a restriction on artificial light. So it can be up to 16 hours of continuous light per day. And then I guess another way of looking at it is there needs to be 8 hours of continuous, like not using of artificial light in indoor housing. And then you'll see this number 4 is highlighted. So this is one of the ones that has a delayed implementation date. So exits and doors. Shelters should be designed so all birds can have easy access to the outdoors and at least 1 linear foot of exit space per every 360 birds. So since this has to do with structures and building, I think that's probably why it has such a long implementation date, so people have time to alter their space if needed. And the regulations also talk about that exits should, on a very large structure, should be distributed throughout the structure so their chickens have easy access to get outdoors. And then lastly on this side are the perches. They're required for layers, 6 inches per bird. And it could include a lighting rail in front of nest boxes, but the slatting on a slatted floor house would not be considered perches. And then more on indoor space, so scratching and dust bathing. Poultry should be able to exhibit that in their living space. And then for non-mobile housing with slatted or mesh floors, there should be a minimum of 15% solid floors. And then as part of these like calculations as people are considering whether their space meets the indoor space requirements, they've outlined that flat areas, including nest boxes, could be considered in that calculation. And then porches and lean-to style structures can be considered part of indoor space calculations if the birds have continuous access to them. So I'll show you a chart in 2 slides that outlines the specific like square footage that's required. But these parts of the regulations kind of try and clarify what you might be able to include in that calculation when we get to it. And then outdoor space, there should be a 75% soil with vegetative cover, up to 25% maybe gravel, concrete, or other surfaces. Shade can be provided as part of outdoor space, and then unenclosed roof structures can be considered outdoor space if birds can move freely between roofed and other outdoor space. So like a structure outside that has no netting or walls on it, that is just a roof that birds could pass under the roof and into the outdoors could be considered part of this. So like an enclosed porch would not be considered outdoor space. So hopefully those things help when thinking about this chart, which is the way that we can calculate to see whether folks meet the stocking density requirements that are now part of OLPS. And you'll see I have highlighted those regulations that have the delayed implementation dates. So maybe I'll just give folks a minute to like look through this because it is a lot of information with the huge variety of poultry housing styles that exist out in the industry. There's a lot of nuance depending on where folks fit into these regulations. And you'll see that for each type of housing, so for example, the mobile housing, it says not to exceed 4.5 pounds of bird weight per square foot, or at least 1.5 square foot per bird. So if you meet one of those qualifications, then you meet the requirement. You don't have to meet both. There's not one that's better than the other to meet. As long as you meet one of them, then you've proven that you comply with the regulation. All right, and then the temporary confinement regulations are very similar if you're familiar with the non-avian livestock temporary confinement requirements. They're very similar. So inclement weather, stage of life, any risk to health, well-being, or safety, if there's a risk to soil or water quality, preventative healthcare procedures or treatment of illness or injury, preparation for shipping or sales, nest box training, or youth projects. And of course, your temporary confinement is something that should definitely be recorded, whether you use NOFA's sheet or a calendar or any type of record that works for you, with either the flock ID or specific animal ID, as well as the dates and the reason that they're being confined. And then just a quick note this is the last section for the last slide for 241, that manure should be managed in a way that doesn't contribute to crops, soil, and water quality. And it kind of reminds me, I meant to say at the beginning of this presentation, but a lot of these things that are now in the regulations, I think a lot of them are things that folks are already doing, that are already considered best practices, and now there are just explicitly written out in the regulations. So hopefully folks are already doing manure management that doesn't contribute to the contamination of crop, soil, and water quality. But I think there's a lot of things in these regulations like that it's hopefully folks are won't have to change too much of their practices to comply. So this is the last quick section of the regulations, and then we can jump into some Q&A and discussion. So the transport and slaughter section is 205, 242. So of course, livestock should be identified during transport. They should be fit to be transported to buyers' auction facilities or slaughterhouses. So calves should have dry navel cords and be able to stand and walk before transportation. And any seriously crippled or non-ambulatory animals should not be transported. So animals that can't walk. Transportation must be seasonally appropriate. So thinking about making sure that animals are protected from the cold or that they have proper ventilation in the summertime. Bedding should be provided as necessary. And if animals are transported more than 8 hours, producers and their or the folks doing the transport should have a plan in terms of water and feeding during an extended period of transport. And then also the regulations now require folks to have emergency plans. So in the event that a truck broke down on a long extended transport day, what might you or the trucker do to maintain the well-being of the animals? And then for poultry slaughter, there's a few explicitly required or prohibited things now in the regulation. So hanging, carrying, or shackling of any lame birds by their legs is prohibited. And then birds hung or shackled on a chain or automated slaughter system should be stunned prior to bleeding. And then birds that must be irreversibly insensible prior to be placed in a scalding tank. All right, so that was a lot of regulatory language and a lot of information. So I just wanted to plug our farmer helpline as well as after this call, we have our weekly farmer forum open house meeting, which is from 3 to 4 every Tuesday. And folks can show up and we can chat about anything that they like, or we can help you with certification paperwork, those sorts of things.